AFL-CIO, speaking at a day of official mourning in New York City, expressed the general sentiment of the labor movement by noting that Roosevelt, quote, consecrated his life to the purpose that the welfare of our great nation is inseparably bound with the welfare of the working people. I am so very pleased to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Jeffrey Edwards, who will then introduce our panelists. Dr. Edwards taught political science at Roosevelt University for 26 years, but he did more than that. He led the faculty through his unwavering integrity, goodwill, and intelligence. A veteran of AIDS activism, he brought to Roosevelt the spirit of social justice and a belief that the faculty had a duty to live out the principles of equity, fairness, and compassion inside and outside the classroom. A beloved teacher, he was also a beloved colleague. He still is, I don't know if they put that in past tense. Respected by all, even people on opposing sides of an issue. We were so lucky to have him roaming the halls of these buildings, and I'm really happy that he's back today. In 2014, Dr. Edwards left Roosevelt to work for the University of Illinois Chicago United Faculty as its inaugural staff organizer. Since then, he has engaged in numerous contract campaigns, including a strike in 2023 that had resulted in UIC faculty being better paid than their non-unionized counterparts at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. UIC-UF also has embraced bargaining for the common good, winning better access to neuropsychological testing and mental health support for students in the context of the COVID pandemic. Himself, a member of Chicago News Guild Communication Workers of America Local 34071, Dr. Edwards is uniquely poised to lead this important discussion today.
How does this work? Is this on? Is it? Can you hear me? Thank you for that sweet introduction, Margie. That wasn't the bio that I sent to you. Thank you very much, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be back at Roosevelt and in Gons Hall. I used to have an office right across the hall from here. At the end of a long day, I could come over here, and one night I'd hear the gospel choir, the next night I'd hear a jazz quartet, the next night I'd hear an opera in rehearsal. This is a really great space, and so happy to be back here and to see a lot of familiar faces. Our topic is unions revitalizing a legacy of the New Deal. And I thought before introducing our guests, I'd say a little bit about what the New Deal was for those who don't know what that term means. We can think of the New Deal as a sort of political arrangement characterized by a particular alignment of voters and elites across the political parties, where the Democratic Party was the dominant party for a number of decades starting in the 1930s. The New Deal also entailed a set of policies and an established way of thinking about the role of government in society that in American political parlance we call liberal, as opposed to the more dominant conservative ideology of the present. The New Deal also built a particular way of life that some people called the American dream, such as the single-family home in a car-centric suburb that was, one has to note, gendered and racially segregated, so all was not perfect. But the New Deal lifted all boats. Some boats were lifted more than others. Some people got more opportunities than others. But it was also the context in which the civil rights movement and the women's movement arose in subsequent decades. In this order, the working class constituted a consistent voting base for the Democratic Party for several decades. And that included the black working class, which had been aligned with the party of Lincoln up until the 1930s. One of the key pieces of legislation passed during Roosevelt's first term in office was the National Labor Relations Act, sometimes called the Wagner Act. in honor of New York Senator Robert Wagner, who was the main proponent of that legislation. This law provided protection for labor organizing and enforcement of collective bargaining, which strengthened the power and economic well-being of the U.S. working class, contributing to a society of growing economic equality. We talk so much about growing economic inequality today, but this is an era of growing economic equality, both directly through organizing and bargaining at the workplace, and also in building the capacity of the working class to act politically to affect the overall direction of U.S. policymaking. The Wagner Act reflected the growing power of the working class and strengthened organized labor because union membership mushroomed under its protections and contracts became much more generous. In short, the Wagner Act and unions were essential to the widespread realization of the American dream, such as it was. I'll say a little bit here as a political scientist, and then I will introduce our guests, and they'll do the most of the talking. How did this all happen? As a political scientist, I always tried to instill in my students that politics is organized combat. And for working people, labor unions meant pooling resources. Many of you have maybe heard of political action committees, where people pool their money and give money to candidates. These were pioneered by the labor movement so that working people could match their bosses in the sphere of political contributions. Unions also meant ongoing political education for their members, the development of specialization and expertise in political operations, and operating simultaneously in multiple arenas, from legislative, executive, judicial, from local, state, and national levels. In short, labor unions allowed the working class people to do combat with their bosses, not just at the workplace, but also in the political arena. But the New Deal order and the power of organized labor that existed in symbiotic relationship declined over the course of the 70s and 80s, and this is a story many people may be familiar with, as employers utilized new technologies to change the production process, globalized through new communication modes and easier transportation modes, and simultaneously, the business class got aggressive politically to start to roll back the gains that the New Deal had brought, targeting the National Labor Relations Act too. It's still in effect. But Donald Trump is not the first person to appoint people to an agency who are opposed to the agency's goals. And so the NLR, the National Labor Relations Board, has been underfunded and staffed with officials who are hostile to labor. In 1972, labor political action committees and business political action committees were giving roughly the same amount of money to candidates in our national politics. By 1980, it was 3-to-1 business over labor, and it just kept multiplying ever since. And they were giving to Democrats as well as Republicans. So that pulled the whole political system in a more pro-business direction. So we see declining rates of unionization, public policies that redistribute income upwards based on a new common sense of trickle-down economics, and a new world of extreme economic and income inequality. With much of our population, especially young folks here, doubting that the American dream, however defined, is within their grasp. With our guests today, we will explore what was labor's role in making the New Deal and what might its role be in securing an American dream for the many today. And we could not have two better people in the whole wide world to be here talking to us about it than the guest sitting to my left. Professor Nelson Lichtenstein is a professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara, an historian of labor, business, and politics. He is the author or editor of 19 books, with one on the way, including State of the Union, A Century of American Labor, The Retail Revolution, How Walmart Created a Brave New World of Business, a biography of the labor leader Walter Reuther, and A Fabulous Failure, The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. I'll add to the list he supplied Walmart, The Face of 21st Century Capitalism, which is a book I used to teach in my urban politics classes here at Roosevelt back in the early 2000s. In 2019 and 2020, he co-edited Beyond the New Deal, From the Great Depression to the Great Recession, and a companion volume, Capitalism Contested, The New Deal and Its Legacies. For nearly 20 years, he directed the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy at UC Santa Barbara. He writes opinion pieces largely for Dissent, Jacobin, New Labor Forum, and the American Prospect. In 2023, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his next book, Why Unions Matter, is forthcoming from Yale University Press. Sara Nelson has served as the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, AFL-CIO, since 2014, representing 55,000 of aviation's first responders at 20 airlines. She has been a flight attendant since 1996 when she started flying at United Airlines. Sara designed the successful payroll support program that was an historic Workers First relief program that kept aviation workers connected to their paychecks, health care, and other benefits for 16 months during the COVID pandemic, while banning stock buybacks and dividends across the industry and, capping executive compensation for 2 years after the relief period ended, making aviation the only industry not to grow in inequality during the pandemic. Sara believes labor should set the agenda every time. The New York Times calls her America's most powerful flight attendant for her role in helping end the 35-day government shutdown. In Style magazine, placed her on their top 50 badass women list. The New Yorker did a major profile in 2022, and Fast Company made her one of their top 10 innovators in the last 10 years. She was elected chair of the International Transport Workers Federation Civil Aviation Section, representing nearly 5 million aviation workers around the world. Sara often says corporations have money and control, but workers have the power. She encourages women everywhere to join unions and run unions. Please welcome Nelson and Sara to Roosevelt University.
Thank you.
And let's start by setting the historical context, if maybe Nelson could talk about the larger political setting, and Sara could talk about the founding of her union in the context of the New Deal.
Now, can you hear that? Can you hear me? Can you hear me without it? No, you want it with? Oh, hi there. Okay, delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here at Roosevelt University and Chicago, one of my favorite cities, and especially delighted to be here sharing the podium with Sara Nelson, one of my heroines, right? And heroes. Roosevelt University is founded 80 years ago, 1945, and I want to make the argument that if you're looking for a moment when American politics, American working people had the potential for being the most progressive, the most transformative, certainly when the unions and working people in general had the potential for the most power, the time is not the 30s, but 1945. In fact, really the spring and summer and fall of 1945. And why is that? Because the 30s were a period of depression. I mean, it was unemployment. People, even when the unions were founded there, famous sit-down strikes, dramatic, took place. But nevertheless, it's a period of unemployment. And as we saw, you saw, I imagine you're all in your early 20s, right? How many of you have worked in a coffee shop or a retail store or something, and there was a period when it was full employment, like 2 years ago, right? That was a period when we saw the Great Resignation. That meant people said, take this job and shove it because I can get a better one. Well, that was a certain amount of power. Well, in the late 30s, that wasn't so much the case, but in 1945, it was. This was the war. Everyone who wanted to have a job had a job in 1945, 1944, 45. More people had blue-collar jobs working in factories than ever before or since in American history. In Chicago, South Chicago, gigantic steel mills. Melrose Park, 20,000 workers building B-29 engines. I mean, this town was booming and strumming, and it was a workers' town. Now, there's nothing great about blue-collar workers as compared to, baristas or, retail workers. There's nothing morally better about a, male blue-collar worker. But it was, in fact, the case that was the period, that was also the period when unions were organizing blue-collar factory workers. And so the union movement, which had gained a lot of workers in the 1930s, yes, but it gained another 50% during World War II because it was full employment and because under the Roosevelt administration, we wanted to win the war. We wanted to win the war in a progressive fashion. So we're gonna, make it so that when workers do go into these new wartime factories, they will, be in unions. At the same time, and this was alluded to, in the 30s was not a particularly good period for when we think about racial equality. Yes, it was there. The left was talking about it, but Roosevelt and even other northern political leaders were, that's an issue we're going to stay away from. Not in World War II, because the first March on Washington, which never happened, but it was threatened in 1941 by the great labor leader A. Philip Randolph, whose center was Chicago, by the way. That was where the Pullman sleeping car porters had their greatest strength. He threatened a march on Washington to demand that African Americans and other people of color, and also including women, as a matter of fact, had the chance to have jobs in the great new war industries. And Roosevelt acceded to that. They passed an executive order which created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which said basically, yes, African Americans and others should have jobs in the war industries, and they did. And in the North, if you were a black steel worker, you were earning, almost as much money as a white steel worker, because you were protected by a union contract, and and the company was paying by the job, not the man. That's what they said. We're paying the job, not by the who you were or what your color was, or etc. So this was a period of great working class self-confidence at the end of the war. And it was a period when the unions were were ambitious. That is not just for higher wages. Yes, important. But what about the whole shape of the economy? What about the whole shape of capitalism? The war had been won by workers, in the battlefronts and at home. Putting out a tremendous amount of wartime propaganda, the home front and the battlefront. And there was a sense of, collective fight there. So the unions at the end of the war, they'd been frustrated by a wage freeze, which was there, by a no-strike pledge they'd given. So in the spring of 1945, when Roosevelt University is being founded by the way, a bunch of radical teachers, who were influenced by this, they said, we want something for the post-war period. We want something better. And so there was a massive strike wave in 1945 and 1946. Really, it bubbled up from below. There were things called wildcat strikes, unauthorized strikes just for a shift or a day or just one department. But people were feeling their oats, and so the massive strike wave and the demands were, yes, for higher wages, but we also want a share in governance of the corporation. We want to organize the South. In 1945, in Alabama, the proportion of workers in a union in Alabama was higher then than it is today in the state of Illinois, you know? So the possibility of organizing the South, textiles, rubber, steel, and even agriculture in the South was right on the agenda. So anyway, this was a tremendous a moment of working class potential. And it was partly, it was both partly successful and partly defeated. That is, this was the beginning of the period when real wages, not phony wages, not inflation wages, but real wages, meaning the standard of living of ordinary Americans, doubled in the next generation, between 1945, 46, and the mid-70s. A generation, 2 generations, it doubled. The only time in American history, going back to the Revolution, forward to today, when that happened. And that did happen, and that's a function of the power of the unions, and also of the kind of Keynesian policies of the Roosevelt administration, which were continued by the Democrats later on. However, the greater ambitions of the union movement to have a share in really running corporations, shifting the wealth of the nation to the working class and away from the capitalists, that was a mixed bag. And then, of course, as was alluded to, McCarthyism and anti-communism came along, and that put the kind of freeze on some of these greater ambitions of the union movement. But I'll stop there and hand it over to Sara.
Thanks, Nelson. So my union was formed the same year that Roosevelt University was founded, 1945. And it was founded first at United Airlines to really lift up flight attendants. At the time, women in the workplace were really only teachers, nurses, telephone operators, and flight attendants. Those were the major jobs where you could actually go out and have a job as a woman and have some independence. And when we first started in the job, the turnover rate was about 18 to 24 months. Because as soon as you got married, or you got pregnant, or you gained more than 115 pounds, or many of the discriminatory practices that made sure that it was only young white women who could do this job, these flight attendants who found this economic independence by having a job wanted to form a union just like others had. And in 1945, on the wave of all of this organizing, and I want to just take us back. Yes, the 30s were not where we made the big gains, but what happened in the 30s was the great uprising of these strikes that Nelson was talking about that generated the power, the political power that made it possible for FDR to sign into law the New Deal, and made it possible for workers have the right to join the union. So it was that major unrest that actually brought employers to the table too, begging for labor law because they wanted stability. They first wanted stability with the Railway Labor Act that was the first labor law that was put in place in the 1930s and gave the pilots the ability to organize under the Railway Labor Act in the 30s, and then other workers followed with the rest of labor in the 40s. And so we were formed in 1945, a union of women, for women, by women, and we were told by the pilots, we're going to come organize you, don't worry about it. But the flight attendants at United Airlines didn't have time to wait. They couldn't wait because they were going to get pushed out. You couldn't keep the job when you hit age 30. You had to leave. So they organized on their own, an independent union, and ultimately, when they went to negotiate that first contract, they negotiated 4 key things. They negotiated a double-digit pay increase. They negotiated a cap on the number of hours that the company could assign them to work. They negotiated a seniority list, because that is what was used to make sure that managers couldn't try to coerce flight attendants to trade sex for schedules, and it was the means by which we used to beat back all the other discriminatory practices going forward. And they negotiated an 8-hour day. And that 8-hour day was on the backs of an 80-year fight by labor before that time to set the 8-hour day as the standard. Well, today, if you think about it, if you think about the provisions of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act that has been watered down since that time, first by Taft-Hartley, and then watered down more and more and more, depleting workers' rights, undercutting the right to strike, undercutting the right to collective bargaining everywhere, and making sure that some workers are completely carved out from those rights too. At the time, the flight attendants used all the things that had been put in place already to form their union, organize that first, or bargain that first contract, and then they went to enforce it. And the very first arbitrator that they had to pay in order to hear a grievance that they had filed, they couldn't pay for because they didn't have enough dues money, so they joined the pilots then. And our union then stayed with the pilots until the jet age hit, and then all of a sudden there were more women that were hired to staff these larger aircraft than there were pilots who were flying the plane, and we had a very amicable divorce with the pilots union because they didn't want the women to outvote them. And so we have continued all these years with a largely comprised membership of women, but through our efforts, through beating back all kinds of discrimination, have a much more society-represented group of members who come from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of ethnicities, all kinds of gender and sexual orientation. And we have pushed forward on those issues and actually made those issues core to our union's #1 priority in 1978, even writing into our Constitution, fighting for the rights of people with gender expression. And think about that. So, we certainly rode the wave of the labor activism, but also were at the forefront of the women's movement in carving out our place in the workplace to be able to keep these jobs, have our own independence, negotiate for jobs that could actually have a living wage that would support a woman on her own. And here we are today.
Thanks, Sara. I wonder if we could go from there to talking about who is a worker. I think a lot of people look back at the 30s and think of the labor movement as a bunch of white men working blue-collar jobs. That was never fully the case, and it certainly isn't the case now. Maybe we could talk a bit more about worker identity today.
Yeah, I think that what's really important, and I'm going to just jump in and then hand it to you, Nelson, but from the dawn of time, the owners have tried to divide workers by race and sex fundamentally, but then by anything else that they can. And they use the 4 Ds of union busting: divide, delay, any results, distract, keep people distracted, and demoralize. Can you see any of these qualities coming out of the White House right now? Just questioning. Okay, so Frederick Douglass wrote about this over 100 years ago, and I just want to read a quote from Frederick Douglass about this basic concept of pitting workers against each other. He said, "The white slave had taken from him by indirection what the black slave had taken from him directly and without ceremony. Both were plundered, and by the same plunderers. The slave was robbed by his master of all his earnings, above what was required for his bare physical necessities, and the white laboring man was robbed by the slave system of the just results of his labor because he was flung into competition with a class of laborers who worked without wages. The slaveholders blinded them to this competition by keeping alive their prejudice against the slaves as men, not against them as slaves." And Nelson mentioned Alabama. Yes, there was great organizing in Alabama, but there was also this terrible continuation of the slave system in the South by incarcerating mostly black men and putting them into forced labor through prison labor. And then making the white workers have to negotiate against that and compete with that. And that is what is happening again today, right now, with all of these prisons that are being built. We have to be very aware that the attack on immigrants, the attack on women, starting with the striking down Roe, and making women, I mean, I can't help but think about it because of all the stories that I've been told by flight attendants, especially early on, who were going to lose their jobs because they had been impregnated through rape on one of their layovers. And so this is a way to control women and to divide the working class and to make some people be in situations where they are forced to be responsive to the owners, and the owners will keep the workers who are considered a higher class of workers, with the way that they define that, in competition with each other by making them believe that, you know, women are below you, you shouldn't think of them as, you know, full citizens or people who should even be out in the workplace. You shouldn't think of black workers as those who are, you know, entitled to have the full benefits of anyone else. And so these are the real constructs by which the owners have controlled the working class forever. And it was really only when the CIO was formed and there was a very intentional effort to bring workers together, no matter their race or their status, to organize by the United Mine Workers in mining towns where the coal barons had hired specifically immigrant labor so that people couldn't talk to each other because they spoke different languages, and to keep the rest of the communities prejudiced against them. So what we see happening right now, these raids in Chicago, what is going on across the country, is an age-old program that has been run by the capitalists since the beginning of time to keep workers at odds with each other. But the reality is that today, because they have stripped so much away from workers and there is such great inequality, almost every single person is a worker by necessity. You cannot live on one income, on one job and one income. In many cases, people are working 2 and 3 jobs, and they're you know, either roommates or family units where there's more than one person going to work and working all that time in order to just live. So this massive inequality has actually created a kind of solidarity among the working class, because our issues are very similar. That what the owners have done through all this time, extracting more labor from us to pay us less, is they have actually created the opportunity for great solidarity like we've never seen before in the labor movement, where women and men and people of color and white workers can all actually come into the union hall and realize that their issues are the same, and that the people who are extracting their labor and exploiting them are the same people too. And we're seeing that, for example, in the Fighting Oligarchy tours that Bernie Sanders and AOC have run, and people really understanding which side we're on.
Hello, yeah, there. Just a quick comment. Donald Trump has committed many crimes, okay? But one crime that he's committing almost always is this. Whenever he wants to sort of make some gesture to you know, the working class or something, he will bring into the White House a bunch of guys. They're always middle-aged guys, often with a helmet on, like coal miners, white guys, pretty much always white guys. And this becomes, that's his image of the working class, you know, middle-aged white guys with you know, coal miner helmets. Now, there are middle-aged white guys with coal miner helmets who are by the working class, but that is not, in fact, as Sara was just making it clear, what the working class is today. But I think that is a stratagem of conservatives to say, oh, what is the working class? Oh, it's these middle-aged white guys with helmets. I mean, and everyone else, well, you're some sort of, I don't know, you have, you know, some particularist, you know, argument. You know, you're LGBTQ or you're Black Lives Matter or something else. But in fact, all those other movements are almost always those of the working class. I mean, the civil rights movement in the classic era was a working class movement, and Martin Luther King made that absolutely clear. And where did lunch counter sit-downs come from? They came from the sit-down strikes. I mean, and King made that absolutely clear then, and I think it's been true today. It's still true today. So I think the racial, multi-ethnic character of the working class is something we have to be totally aware of. Now, just to make an historical analogy, in the 1930s and 40s, you know, that was a period when Italians, Hungarians, Slavs, Jews, not to mention African Americans, you know, who are they? They're kind of un-Americans. And one of the things the CIO did was to make that clear that then those ethnic groups, which today we think of, oh, of course, you know, they're all white, you know, ethnics, you know, many of them are voting for Trump, unfortunately, and you know, but nevertheless, in the 30s and 40s, and even into the 50s, they were kind of, you know, vaguely un-American if you were hyphenated, Italian American, Hungarian American, Slavic American. But the CIO and the union movement, you know, created a sense of unity, and I think over generations that's absolutely the case today. And so, you know, our task, and the unions are the vehicle to do that, is a place where, you know, people of all sorts, documented, undocumented, doesn't matter, you know, whatever what gender, race, etc. This is a place where if a union is going to be successful, it has to create everyone the system of equality. It's not just some nice idea or some moral idea. If you want to have a strike, you know, you can't have, you know, a certain percentage of your workers strike breaking because, you know, they happen to be of a certain gender or race or sexual orientation. You have to have everybody in solidarity. And so that's just the essence of unionism. So that's my point.
Thanks, both of you. I'm wondering if we could move on then to where does that take us going forward? What role can organized labor play in achieving economic justice, fighting for democracy, challenging authoritarianism?
So organized labor is down to just 6% of the private sector. Less than 10% if you include the public and federal sector, and dramatically dropping. You know, Trump just got rid of bargaining rights for almost 1 million federal workers. Some of that is still being held up in the courts, but largely he has extinguished contracts across the federal government and sought to dismantle the federal government. And this is another way also that workers are divided, is to believe that, you know, government's the problem, not the solution, as Ronald Reagan famously said, and to believe that government is a big bureaucracy, and so there is a bias against federal workers. Well, federal workers are food inspectors, and they cure cancer, and they are helping to direct our planes safely to the airports, and they are also making sure there aren't security threats at our airports. And they are really our friends and neighbors across the country, not just in Washington, real everyday people who have a tremendous sense of duty to their fellow citizens within the United States, real people, not bureaucrats. And so we have to break through all of these narratives that make us believe that we are at odds with each other. Now, I want to give you a little bit of hope here, because this does really feel like we are in the middle of an extreme crisis. We have our earth burning. How many people are worried about the climate crisis? Raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, and we're barely talking about it right now, right? So we have all these crises going on right now. And right now, I would say there's an immediate crisis of having millions of workers without getting a paycheck, some of them forced to come to work for free in this government shutdown. And we also have a looming deadline of November 1st to continue the subsidies of the ACA, because as people go to sign up for their health care this year, if those costs are so great because those subsidies are not continued, that is going to have a spiraling effect on everyone else, and it's going to be a death spiral for our healthcare system that already doesn't work. So the immediate demand right now, and what we have to do, is get wins along the way. Labor has to figure out what are the most urgent issues, define what those issues are, define what we're going to do about it, and demand that politicians come to us. So I'm registered with one of the two major parties, but I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as an activist for working people. And when you think of yourself that way, and you don't think about elected politics as being the answer, because that's where we've gone to. As unions have shrunk, Many of the deals or contracts that were done sort of behind closed door company business unionism, where people were relying on relationships rather than the power of strikes in order to get agreements done. And we lost the idea of collective bargaining. We lost the idea that you can actually come to the table and have results and have people on two extremely different sides, but when they face either workers being locked out or workers striking against that company and there's real consequences, that encourages people to reach an agreement rather than to go without agreement. So the destruction of unions has also destructed the idea of democracy, that we can actually have different ideas, debate those ideas, and ultimately come to a resolution. Remember delay, one of the union busters' tactics? The delay of getting any resolution in government is denying people the ability to actually think that the government can work for them. That's why people are falling away from even participating in democracy or understanding why we need to fight for it, because democracy has not worked for people. If you see the Economic Policy Institute graph of inequality going up, on a strict line from 1981, when Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers and told the rest of corporate America that it was open season on labor and that the strike was a dirty word, equality went straight up, wages remained essentially flat. There's another chart that you can lay over that is about productivity, the American worker productivity going way up, where essentially one worker today does the job of 3 workers in 1980. And union density, I'm sorry, I got these charts mixed up, but you'll get the point. Union density going directly down. So if you live in a system of capitalism, we don't just have a democracy, we have capitalism as the background. And if you don't have a check on capitalism that has no integration, no interest in humanity, that is not a part of the equation in capitalism. So capitalism and the idea of competition and the idea of innovation and having people, believe that they can do better is by having all these opportunities. That only works when you have some guardrails on that. And the real guardrails are allowing the masses to actually have a voice and not just have a few people with all the money have all of the power. So unions have to open their arms wide to the working class, more than 70% and higher with the next generation that are approving of unions. And I believe that is because starting right here in 2012 with the Chicago Teachers Union and Karen Lewis saying, no, we're going to strike, and we're going to strike for the common good. We're not just going to strike for the issues that teachers care about. We're going to strike for the issues that matter to the kids and their parents. And in the communities, we're going to make sure that on our list is affordable housing for people. We're going to make sure that we actually create a place where students can learn because they can come to school and be nourished. And setting out the idea that the working class can actually set the agenda for the community. And that strike in 2012 is what sparked the idea across the country of teachers everywhere where they don't even have collective bargaining rights, like in West Virginia, to stand up and say, we're going to strike too. And to Nelson's point about all these different kinds of strikes, wildcat strikes and everything else, there has been this attempt to destroy the legal right for workers to strike. But if we understand fundamentally that there are no illegal strikes, there are only unsuccessful ones, and when workers actually exercise that power together and refuse to give our labor to that system that is keeping us under the thumb of the billionaires, everything stops. And if you generate enough power, you can actually get results. So before the Wagner Act, workers had to strike for recognition, and the companies had to come begging to them and say, okay, well, we'll negotiate with you. That's how it worked before. And that's how it can work now when there's a dismantling of our laws, dismantling of our institutions like the NLRB. People are saying, oh, how are we going to organize? How are we going to do this? Well, right now in Indiana, there are 200 dealers at a horseshoe casino about 45 minutes south of Indianapolis, who are on strike right now for recognition for their union, just like they did in the 1930s, because the NLRB is not functional because they don't have a functioning NLRB, but also there's a government shutdown, so there's no way to even file for a union election. We shouldn't just confine ourselves to think about participating in the system that exists. What we should be doing is setting the agenda, which is what our union did at the onset of COVID when we said, we're not going to have a relief system like we had after 9/11, where they just gave the money to the airlines, and the airlines were supposed to spend it in a way that was going to help to save the jobs for the workers. We lost our pensions in that system. We lost 100,000 aviation workers in that system. There were outsourced workers who were now working for low wages and no benefits in that system. Hell no, we're not going to do that. So we said that the airlines were going to have to negotiate with us before anything was passed by Congress. And we got the first Workers First program that said that any money that came from the government was going to simply be passed through the payroll system at the airlines, go directly to the workers, keep us in our jobs. They could not furlough us, they could not decrease our pay, and they had to put a cap on their compensation and ban stock buybacks even after that program was over. And that is the kind of thinking that we can do as labor, not just in our unions, but if you are a worker, you're a part of the labor movement. That's what I want all of you to hear out here and everybody listening online. You are a part of the labor movement, because if we understand that as working people and we organize and we go out to these events that are happening, we go out to protest and you bring 5 people with you, you're a union activist. If you tell those 5 people to bring 5 people with them the next time, and you exchange cell phone numbers and you plan to meet up at the next event, now you're a union organizer. You don't have to be certified by the government to be a union and act like a union and act with that solidarity and have that kind of mindset that actually, as the working class, we have the power to set the agenda for what we want our world to look like. And so that was a crisis then, but we have these crises now. Labor needs to be setting a solution, fighting for that, backing that up with what we're willing to do to fight for it, which I'm calling for a general strike right now. We have to be willing to do that and understand that in this crisis for our world right now, this is also an opportunity to build an entirely new economy. So as things are very well defined about which side you're on, we can bring the working class together to take on the oligarchs and deny the efforts of the union buster to have us believe that we're actually at odds with each other.
Yeah, right. I agree with that. I agree entirely with that. Okay. I want to make. How many of you took part in the No Kings demonstration of recent? Okay, I see some hands going. How many of you were in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations? Any? Yeah. Okay, good. So America has a great tradition of having big demonstrations on lots of issues. A Day Without Immigrants was another one a few years ago, and we do that. And that's democracy. That's free speech. That's right of assembly. That's important, and we should do that. One of the problems of that is, though, that the day after those gigantic demonstrations, or the month or two after the Black Lives Matter went on for quite a while, what happens then? What is the voice of those hundreds of thousands of millions of people who are out in the streets? How does that make itself felt, a day after, 5 days after, 2 weeks after, a year after, 2 years after? And we've seen now the Trumpite assault on civil rights and rights of immigrants and et cetera. And where's the organizations that's resisting that? So one of the things that unions do, it's very elementary. It's incredibly elementary, but they're a permanent organization. They actually have paid staff, believe it or not, whose job it is. Some people, the paid staff can be sometimes self-serving, but their job is to continuously make the organization continuous and mobilize and bring more people in. And unfortunately, that's something that this great No Kings demonstration, and I was there, I was right out there for sure, I guarantee it, I'll be on the next one. But we don't have a mechanism yet to make the No Kings, the 7 million people in the No Kings demonstration, a kind of organization. Maybe we had a Labor Party in this country, or we had some other thing of that sort, but we don't have it. We do have unions. And that's the virtue of trade unions. They are there. The Chicago Teachers Union, which had this terrific strike in 2012, has had others since then, they're still there. They were there in 2012, they're there today. And so that's, now, capitalists know that.
And they have the mayor in the mayor's office.
They elected the mayor, that's right. Capitalists know this. They know this. So, for example, wages went up a lot in 2001 and 2021, 2022. Black Lives Matter, all sorts of corporations fell over themselves to create DEI things within the corporations. But corporations know, and capitalists know, let's just wait a little while. Wait for that impulse to die down. Wait for inflation to come back and erode the wage gains that were made because there was a tight labor market. They know about that. Let's just wait a couple years. If there's no organization, then okay, we'll go back to things the way they were. And I mean, and this is like incredibly elementary point, but that's what unions are there. They say, well, wait, inflation's gone up, so we want another wage increase. No, we aren't going to just settle for what the corporations want. And this has been true. We've had this whole kind of generation, maybe they're dying off now, of kind of liberal, corporate executives, who are, good on this or that issue. But when it comes to unions, they're absolutely, reactionary and against it. I mean, it's incredible. And there's a reason for that. They're smart. They aren't dumb. There's a reason for that. They don't want a permanent organization of people, who they employ, who are going to raise issues year after year, and after the demonstration's over. And so that's why it's good. And that's one reason I think there are many things that are they're very, very clever over many years, court decisions, administrative rulings, the kind of people who are on the NLRB, the kind of, there are many reasons that it's now, frankly, it's just a standard operating procedure for most corporations to break the law in order to break a union. That's just, and the financial penalty is minuscule. Maybe later on I'll have a chance to talk. I think I have a solution to that, but I won't say that now.
Sara, did you want to say anything before we opened it up?
Yeah, I think so. Nelson is exactly right. And getting back to the New Deal and celebrating what we were able to accomplish in the Roosevelt years was started from the power of working people rising up. And then Roosevelt actually was able to put into law the right of unions to do that and to have those rights under the law, which was later eroded. But the safety and health provisions that went in place during that time under the leadership of Francis Perkins and the wage and hour protections, all of those things were only actually assured in a workplace if there was a union enforcing them. Because even though there's a law, if an individual worker stands up and says to the corporation, you have to follow the law, how likely is it, do you think, that that corporation is going to be responsive to that worker? But if that worker is a union member and says that, and the corporation knows that that worker is backed by occupational health and safety specialists at the union, by lawyers at the union, by other staff that are resourced because of the pooling of resources from the union members' dues in order to have these experts and the backing to be able to enforce those laws. If you can write all the laws that you want. If you don't have organizations that can help workers actually enforce the laws that are there to protect them, because corporations will take issues that individual union members experience, like, for example, an occupational injury. They will try to outlast the worker by saying this is not an approved benefit, and the worker who is injured, and sometimes injured and either taking drugs that are sort of altering their ability to think, or they've been injured and they can't, they're having neurological problems like the fume events on planes that our union has been fighting for 40 years, and you can look up a recent Wall Street Journal article on this. But if they don't have the ability and the union backing them, the corporations intend to just outweight the workers until they can't last anymore, or they can't stand to actually go through the process of holding the corporation accountable and waiting that out. They need relief right then. And so that either leads to them going somewhere else to try to make money or try to survive in some other way, or in many cases that ends in suicide. And that is just fine with the corporations too. So it is really, if we don't have unions like Nelson is talking about, and you don't have that continued institution to be able to hold up all those advancements that you make, it gets eroded. So not only did we have an attack on what we achieved during the New Deal, but we had an attack on unions because unions built up what we achieved in the New Deal with the promise of achieving more and more. And then unions were attacked, and we couldn't even enforce the laws that we had.
Thanks. Let's open it up and see if people have questions. And Margie, is there a speaker? There's a speaker here. Anybody want to step up and ask a question? Here's somebody right up here, right up in the front here.
Hello? Okay. So my name is Jack. I'm a student here at Roosevelt, and I wanted to ask you guys a question, specifically on the dying class consciousness of American people, workers, where they may share like frustrations with like other workers, but they almost are unaware of where their problems come from. I want to know what you guys think about that and where it comes from.
That people maybe don't have a consciousness as a worker. They're facing problems,
Yeah.
but they're not constructing it, if I might elaborate, that it's the problem of the boss.
Yeah.
It's something else that's undefined. Is that, yeah.
Let me take one little stab at that, and then I'm sure Sarah can elaborate a good. I mean, one of the things about just working, a lot of times, most times, people want a kind of non-conflictual, easygoing, routine. People don't want to be fighting all the time. They want it to be harmonious. Now, then they have problems. What do you do when you have a problem at work? Well, you can quit. That's one thing and there's a lot of turnover. People do quit. Although the problem there is the next job you get won't be any better. You can stay and fight, but if you're by yourself, that's not going to be too effective. And then again, forming with your workmates, doing something that's actually legal. It's protected by law, but the law isn't that good. However, here's the thing: consciousness. You mentioned the term consciousness. So most times, people are, okay, I want to get along. I don't want to fight. I got other problems. Let's just go to work. Then occasionally things do happen. Oh, people are pissed off, and they collectively are pissed off. Consciousness is episodic. It rises, it falls. Sometimes it's right there on top, and other times it's not. And often this happened with the baristas at Starbucks. It happened with all sorts of workers when they're pissed off. The boss will accede to what they want. Yes, we'll give you an extra $1 an hour. Yes, we'll do this, we'll do that. But then again, they wait, and times go on. People leave, turnover, and consciousness, as it were, falls. What a union does is to crystallize a high level of consciousness in an institution, which continually reproduces it. Again, with people who are committed, who maybe even are paid to do it. And that's something that I think is really important and which is lacking in American life. We don't have that. If we were in Europe at a certain time, we'd have a Labor Party that did that. But the Democratic Party, unfortunately, is a sort of mixed bag on that question. But unions do that, and I think that the function of a as one famous organizer said, the function of an organizer, a social organizer, is to turn people on fire. You know, he's a social arsonist. He or she is a social arsonist whose job is to turn people on fire. But once they're on fire, that's not enough. You then have to create an organization which keeps the fire burning. And that's what Sara's been doing all her life.
Oh, well, let me give you the example of Delta Airlines, okay? So we are 80% organized in the airline industry. The one major airline that doesn't have a union for flight attendants or many of its other workers, with the exception of pilots, is Delta Airlines. And I talked about that Workers First program during COVID, and I told you about the parameters of it. One item that was written into the draft bill was that corporations could not spend any money to interfere with their workers' free right to join a union. Now that's in the Railway Labor Act. It was really just saying you can't spend any money to break the law. And Delta Airlines spent all of its time not advocating for the billions of dollars it needed to survive during the pandemic. They spent all of their political power on trying to strike that one sentence from the law, and they were successful. The one thing they didn't want to have to comply with was giving their workers the free right to join a union, okay? So we've been on this organizing drive forever. Delta Airlines, you're saying, why does this happen? Why do people not have this consciousness? Because there is an active effort for corporations to spend more money on union busting than anything else, and when they have to, they will. And so what Delta Airlines would do is they would say, we're a very progressive organization. You don't need to have a union here because we're going to pay you well. We're going to give you that extra dollar. We're going to actually pay to be the biggest sponsor at the MLK parade. We are going to be the biggest sponsor in the New York Pride Parade, and we're going to tell the Pride Parade that they can't let other airlines even participate. So they would promote this idea, you don't need a union here because we are benevolent, we're going to take care of you. And what they do is they just wait it out until you don't have to be there anymore. That is fine if you have societal norm. I mean, it's not fine, but it works when you have societal norms that say that as an airline, you should be accepting everyone. You should be making space for the ADA community. You should be, making sure that there is equal treatment of everyone on your plane, and your workers should be treated the same. It is not okay when all of a sudden you have this narrative that we are at odds with each other and we should actually be carving ourselves up by political identification too. After the murder of Charlie Kirk, there was a concerted effort to get workers fired who had spoken up in their own time on social media about not about his killing, but about the ideas that he represented and how they were glad that those ideas were gone or had made some sort of comment like that. Delta Airlines fired people, and in fact fired their top anti-union activists for flight attendants who had been a brand ambassador for more than 20 years for Delta Airlines. That is making other flight attendants say, whoa, if Delta can do that to their number one guy, they could do it to me. And our campaign at Delta is actually taking off like gangbusters now, but we're in a race against time to get a union for people. Usually when people need a union and they haven't had a consciousness that they need one, once they need it, it's too late to get it. And that has been because there has been an effort by the capitalists forever to try to have people believe that unions are not in their interest, that unions are an outmoded idea, that unions don't represent actually you, they only represent this certain kind of worker. There has been a persistent effort, and I would take that a step further and say, taking over all of our journalism and owning our journalism and firing journalists and extracting journalists from being able to do their duty and report on their jobs, and especially after there has been a wave of organizing across, especially online media in recent years. And so there is a consciousness by all of the reporters and journalists who have been doing this work that they are workers too, and they know what it's like to join a union. That has changed the consciousness of the people who were reporting. But more and more you have hedge funds buying out media outlets and extracting all the value and then putting them out of business and denying the rest of us the ability to access the information and be able to make a decision for ourselves. There is so much propaganda that is pushed at us to have us believe that the unions are not in our interests and that we're at odds with each other, so you shouldn't even enter that union hall to have a conversation with someone else.
Jack, is that an answer for you? Any follow-up? Okay. I'm just, as an organizer myself, I see that as an organizing problem.
Yep.
Having conversations with people who are talking about problems and maybe don't see it as an issue of the boss, but giving people opportunities to work with others to solve those problems, that shifts the consciousness.
In an optimistic way, though, I do want to say this, okay? People are much more likely, people that you know are much more likely to believe you than something that they see on social media, something that they read in the paper, something that they see on TV. And so that getting back to that face-to-face organizing when we're in a time of being so online is so critically important. We can't undervalue that. We can use the tools online to connect with each other, but we can't undervalue the conversations that we have within our own orbit and how much of a difference that can make in actually organizing a resistance.
Other questions? I think we've got one right here.
You want me to go? You want to go, Dr. Ron? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank y'all for attending. I think y'all said a lot, right? A lot of great information. I think I was trying to figure out what question y'all was trying to center on, and I came up with what role does organized labor unions play in the rise of social movements? And I think some of the answers was the expansion of participatory democracy. And I think the most interesting aspect of the discussion for me was workers' identity, where you point to Frederick Douglass Roosevelt in explaining this high-low worker class attitude. But I didn't hear any mention of the role of the unreserved employed army play in this overall conflict with workers' identity. And how does that have a role with the problem that y'all announced with the expansion of participatory democracy, where you say people don't participate? So what's the answer to why?
Well, by participation, people participate when they see a possibility of a road forward that can be successful. In other words, oppression itself doesn't create activism; it creates people retreat. But if you both are together and you see a road forward, then whole new layers of the population can be involved. And I might as well take my 1 minute here to talk about general strikes, because there was a good deal of discussion about that on the No King's Day. They know that those demonstrations alone are not going to do it. We've had general strikes in America that were not called general strikes. Actually, in 1945 and 46, there were citywide general strikes in Oakland, for example, and other little smaller cities, and we've had them at Detroit in the late 30s. General strikes take place when the state comes in and is oppressive on the side of corporations or simply oppressive itself. And that's what we're seeing right now, and certainly in the city of Chicago. And when you have, and I think the Red State Revolt, the teachers' unions in West Virginia and places like that, were in effect general strikes. You had, in that period, whole new layers of the population. This is only 2019, 18, 19, who came in on behalf of the teachers, and that happened in Chicago in 2012 as well, because they could see that the unions were providing a road forward. And I think that if the Chicago Teachers Union, and gosh, you know, the mayor of Chicago has practically endorsed this. Chicago Teachers Union would say, because of the ICE raids, it's unsafe to go to school. And we're urging our students and teachers and everyone else in the city to stay away because, you know, for the rest of the week because of these ICE raids. I think that would have a tremendous amount of support way beyond just the schools or anyone else. And I think that's the kind of dynamic. You have state repression, you have, you know, clearly illegal, and then you have the unions taking the lead. That's the kind of thing that could happen. And when that happens, what's great about what happens in a general strike is that people who are not affiliated, people who in fact are kind of middle class, people who are kind of, you know, or even part of the, beyond that, say, oh, the unions and the workers are giving leadership, and I'm going to be part of that. And that happened in Brazil. It happened in Poland. It's happened in the U.S. in San Francisco and in Seattle nearly a century ago. But it could happen again. And I think that those kind of mobilizations take on a dynamic of themselves, and they create hope and a road forward that people didn't see before.
Yes, without a doubt. But also, you have to build towards that. And what the Chicago Teachers Union is doing right now in building community support around these ICE raids and having parents positioned on every corner of every block around the schools with whistles and ready to respond, and everyone knows what to do and how to respond, and they're signing up to be part of the rapid response. That is all part of building the structure that makes it possible to have a general strike. So you do have to build that. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And it's not just gonna be like everybody's randomly getting in the streets. We also have to be clear about what we're fighting for and what our demands are when we withhold our labor. What is it that we're actually asking to be done? And so all of those things have to be in place, but the Chicago Teachers Union is a phenomenal example of building the kind of structure that we need to pull off a general strike that would make a real difference.
So I know some people have to go to class. Professor Rung, can we take one more question or one more question?
Good afternoon, Mike Pinsoff, proud member and organizer of the Roosevelt Adjunct Faculty Organization. Following up on both of your comments about a general strike, Ms. Nelson, what does that look like? You called for it specifically. Does it include or does it go broader than airline workers going out on strike in support of the air traffic controllers, obviously closely related to your job functions, or is your concept broader than that? And Professor Lichtenstein, have those kind of general strikes been successful, and do you predict it would be successful in this environment that we find ourselves in today?
Well, here's what I would say, and I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but in 2018-19, there was the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, 35-day government shutdown. And what we were doing, and in every case, let me say this, you have to define the problem, you have to set your demands, you have to back up your demands with what you're willing to do, and you have to add urgency. And so in that shutdown in 2019, which by the way was supposedly because Trump wanted to build his southern border wall, so there was this racist fear-mongering that was this distraction from what was really going on. Once we realized as a union, as the flight attendants union, that counts on air traffic controllers to be able to do their jobs, to keep ourselves safe, counts on TSA agents to be able to keep us safe and secure, and neither one of those work groups had the backing of the other people who were on furlough, who usually give them the backing to do their job. And we learn in safety-sensitive positions that the first rule in safety is to remove all distractions. Well, what could be more distracting than not getting a paycheck? And so we continued to define the safety issues. So we were defining the problem. We continued to do that throughout the shutdown, to talk about why it was a problem that the government was shut down. But then, when we came to day 30, I was actually getting an award from the AFL-CIO at the Martin Luther King dinner, and I took that opportunity to say, labor can end this shutdown with a general strike. So the demand was open the government. It was very clear. There were 1 million workers who were out of work or forced to come to work without pay. Another 1 million contractors who were out of work. And while I was talking about all this, I took a cab ride across Washington, D.C., and I did a couple of news media interviews in the cab. So the cab driver was listening to all of this. And the one thing that really touched me, actually, was that as I was getting out of my office and I was handing the cab driver the fare with cash, he turned around and he grabbed my hand, and he had a tear running down his face, and he said, "Thank you, because you're fighting for me too." Because during the government shutdown, no one was coming to work. And so we were really defining that this was a humanitarian crisis across the board, and our union was preparing to strike, and we were very clear about that. We were preparing for a safety strike because we couldn't go to work in unsafe conditions, and passengers looked to us about whether or not it's safe, and at a certain point, we were gonna have to call it and say it's unsafe to go, and we were getting to that place. But we also had called on the rest of the labor movement to say, this is a humanitarian crisis, and we can end it right now by stopping it with a general strike. And so once we defined that, and then when a few air traffic controllers the very next day couldn't go to work safely because they have to sign in, "I'm fit for duty," every single day, and they physically could no longer do the job, and a few flights started to cancel in LaGuardia, guess what? All of a sudden, the southern border wall didn't matter anymore, and we had a solution with the federal government in a matter of hours that couldn't be solved in 35 days. And it was because labor was about to get a taste of our power, and that was the one thing that the GOP couldn't handle, because it was going to upend everything. They were trying to use that shutdown to privatize everything, which is what we really understood. But when we defined that labor was going to take control, it took it away from politics and put it in the power of the people, and they did not want people to understand the power that we had with denying our labor. So that is why that shutdown ended, and I give that as an example because it's a clean example. We had a demand. We defined the problem. We had a demand. We were saying what we were going to do to back up our demand, and there was certainly urgency because people's lives are on the line. And that is the kind of, that is what we have to think about. So there has to be those same elements in order to make it work. But we can certainly do that if we start organizing for that and thinking about that and thinking about what our demands are. And I think our demands are really simple, actually. It goes back to what Roosevelt said after the New Deal, which was the second Bill of Rights, which was the Economic Bill of Rights. A right to a living wage, a decent home, a right to health care as a human right, a right to protection in the event of illness or old age or any kind of disability, and a right to an education. And if you add into that also the right to ensure that your tax dollars don't go to building weapons of mass destruction, but actually fund the communities right here and call for peace around the world, I think we've got a compact here that people can get behind.
I would say that historically, looking at the 20th century, the time when you've had really things that are equivalent of a general strike or a kind of, beyond the labor movement at the core of it, but beyond that as well, it really is fights against authoritarian governments. Now, there's a debate going on the on the left. Oh, should we demand things like like better health care, and maintaining, the Obamacare, or are we talking about democracy? I mean, the two obviously go together. But when you look at places like Eastern Europe, in the 1980s, or Brazil, or other places, or actually more recently, even today in Hungary and Serbia, where we've had big demonstrations and strikes. I mean, the issue of democracy does affect everyone, and certainly the working class. And I think so. I think that really what was happening in 2019, Trump has always been an authoritarian, and to check him, is something that can bring wider circles of the population into a movement, and that's essential to do. And I think we're at that moment now, and it is, and I do want to. Sara made something. You do have to have a demand that you can achieve. It's not, we aren't calling for a revolution. notion, not at least at this point, but we want to demand whether that's the ice out of Chicago, or make it safe to fly in 2019. You have to have a specific demand for a kind of this larger movement, and I think that, and also a demand that, of course, will appeal to people beyond the union movement itself. And I think that's a possibility right at this moment.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. I know you need to push on. Please recognize our guests. Thank you very much.